For everyone with an interest in MASH, or more broadly, steatotic liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 4, Episode 49 of the podcast, now officially known as Surfing the MASH Tsunami, starts now.
Today on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
I thought it was helpful to spend a little bit more time thinking about the two FGF21 papers in cirrhosis, the pegozafermin and the efruxifermin paper, because obviously that's another area that needs a lot of help. It's starting to look like the class might help.
Yeah, I have a slightly different bias, Roger. When you talk about cirrhosis, holding steady on the level of fibrosis is not good enough. We really need to have mechanisms that regress fibrosis, and that's a very tall order in that stage of disease, and we don't really have drugs that are specifically aimed at that. I'm cautiously pessimistic, shall we say, that there's going to be major breakthroughs with the existing drugs in cirrhosis.
If, in fact, those drugs can merely attenuate, but they buy us time, or they buy patients time for us to get to better agents, to me, that's a huge step in the right direction.
Couldn't agree more, Roger.
I don't think you can rely on a single marker. You need a kind of a cluster of several, at least 2 or 3 unrelated markers going in the same direction for this to be a strong signal. Otherwise, you cannot trust or rely on a single marker.
There was another poster doing methotrexate, and because we now have surrogate markers like VTCE and that we can monitor serially these patients. So over a number of years, they've gone on to sort of support the evidence that methotrexate doesn't cause more fibrosis, and there's been a couple of evidence-based papers out recently that have done that. So it was now looking at, we've got enough data on long cohorts, even of small numbers, to look at with some of these surrogate markers now.
Every week, a global community of fatty liver disease stakeholders comes together to explore the most important challenges in diagnosing, treating, and developing medications for patients with fatty liver diseases. Join liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and their guests, hepatology researchers and key opinion leaders Professors Scott Friedman and Laurent Castera, as they review highlights from the Liver Meeting 2023 on Surfing the MASH Tsunami.
Today's episode of Surfing the MASH Tsunami, reviewing the highlights of TLM 2023, is sponsored by Madrigal Pharmaceuticals.
Madrigal Pharmaceuticals is a clinical-stage biopharmaceutical company pursuing novel therapeutics for non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, NASH, a liver disease with high unmet medical need. Madrigal's lead candidate, Resmetirom, is a liver-directed THR-beta agonist oral therapy that is designed to target key underlying causes of NASH. For more information, visit www.madrigalpharma.com.
Well, we're back from Boston, where we all were last week. Most of us were last week for 7,500 strong, another 800 on video, for a fascinating conference. The most interesting comment I heard from the whole thing came from our friend Mike Charlton, who said to me, this feels like a pre-pandemic Congress. And I got the sense of what he was talking about. I think people, a little bit of this in Vienna. Vienna felt the same way to me. But people are actually now back into kind of typical conference life, typical conference speed. Folks don't worry about standing close to each other, which there was for a while, all that other stuff. So we have with us, Louise is with us today. Jorn is not with us. He'll be off until sometime in December. He's got some things he's taking care of. But we're fortunate enough to have two of our very favorite people with us, Scott Friedman. Scott, how are you this afternoon?
I'm great, Roger. I just had to silence my microphone because of the New York City sirens that are a permanent backdrop of my life.
Scott, I was about to mention exactly that thing. Scott lives in New York City. I lived in New York City for a while, and the sirens really do become part of your life. If you hear Scott get a question, and it sounds like he's on 3-second delay because he has to get himself unmuted for the sirens. And Laurent Castera, Laurent, you came back with a little touch of COVID, huh?
Yes. Hello, how are you, everybody? I don't have any siren. I'm in Paris, and we don't have siren like New York.
Okay. It's a much more civilized city, right?
Absolutely.
The sirens are much sexier, too.
Yeah, the sirens are better there. I agree with you. You don't have as many of them, and they're better sirens. I totally agree. And then finally, we have Louise. And how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. Nice to see the guys on and hear their tales from AASLD. Looking forward to it.
So I spent some time in Boston with Somerset Chauvinists.
Predictive Health Team, was that?
Predictive Health Team, yeah, that's right.
I'm sure they'll love the term.
They probably will. They have a sense of humor. They're all good. So with that, why don't we dive in and get started? Icebreaker, real simple, just one good thing, personal, professional, that's happened in your life in the last week. Brave one, go first.
Well, I learned that during the course of our renovation at home that started the 3-month timeline is now up to 5 months.
So where's the good news in that one, Scott? Is it in the money, the timing, or the fact that you're not going to...
It's going to cost me a fortune, but it's going to be a really nice floor.
Well, we're happy for you. So I celebrated getting back from Boston by spending 3 hours on Saturday on a date with my 5-year-old granddaughter, just the two of us. Fantastic day. She's a wonderful, wonderful kid. We spent time with her in Disney World before that. And they are the best days of my life at this point. In fact, they're great days. I'm not qualified. They are just great days and the best days of my life.
I'm with you on that.
So that was real joy. Next.
Oh, I'll jump in next. I suppose my positive was that my husband was awake when the tap connection blew in our bathroom here. So he's in Perth and I'm in the UK, and I'm in the top floor with a tri-valve that's having burst with hot water. And it was a case of trying to locate the stopcock for the house. So I got very wet. My downstairs has recovered. The ceiling will need a little bit of work, but the fact that he was contactable so that we could work it out. And there's nothing like somebody going, don't panic, from the other side of the world when you're covered in water, this side of the world going, right, that's a really good suggestion. Louise, I survived.
So Louise, all I want to know is, will you have a really nice ceiling?
It's a house that's probably dated to the 16 or 1700s. So it's a very old house. There's not a straight line in any of it. So it will be a paint job over the dried out plaster, because you can't put a straight ceiling into something this old with beams. It's very entertaining. But yes, I survived after that, and now know exactly where all the stopcocks are.
Very, very good. So, Laurent, we've got expense, we've got discomfort, and we've got joy. What do you want to show up with for Groundbreaker?
Now, joy. I was happy to be back home after traveling for a week. That's all. Simple joy.
I guess the quick recovery from COVID probably counts for a little bit too. So with that, why don't we dive in? What we're going to do is spend the next hour or so reviewing some of the highlights of Boston. I don't think you can do a conference like that in an hour and do it any kind of justice. So what I'd like to start with, though, is just by asking each of us, starting with one of you, for general impressions of the meeting, what you thought were its strengths, if you thought it had shortcomings that were worth noting, throw those out as well. And then after that, we're going to dive in. We're going to talk about the drugs. We're going to talk about the NITs. We're going to talk about the basic science. And we're going to talk about the patient and associated professional focused material, if we have time to get to all of that. General impressions, brave one, go first.
Great to be at an ASLD that feels like an ASLD.
What made it feel that way?
I would say more interactions, just an imperceptible buzz and excitement. I think you had cited Mike Charlton. I fully agree. There was really no hovering COVID. Some people wore masks, of course, but ironically, one of our speakers here is just getting over COVID. But in general, I don't think it permeated the mood at all, which was reassuring.
I agree.
Boston is a comfortable venue. I think we're used to it. It's very convenient. And there's not a whole lot to do except go to the meeting. So people show up and they listen, which is also very nice.
Oh, but if you're going home on the train, Scott, you can stop at Italy and get food to take home with you. You can have a feast on the train on the way.
I did go to Italy. It's terribly overpriced, and we have, I think, 2 in New York already, so it wasn't exactly a novelty. The mall did clean up a lot since the last time we were there.
Yeah, they don't have an Italy in New Hope, and I had a 5.5-hour train ride home, so I was able to buy myself a very nice lunch. And yes, it was overpriced, but given the options on the train, it was a big step in the right direction.
I will say the absolute worst thing of the meeting, and I think almost everybody will agree, was that app. It was absolutely dreadful. I can't even begin to count the ways it was infuriating. I couldn't figure out what was on the program. I couldn't figure out where. They had this quirky little thing where if your phone turns off and you're on a page, you have to go right back to the top of the day and keep scrolling every time. I just gave up on it.
Yeah, I think it was truly dreadful. By the way, I might at least tie for the worst app story in that the sessions never loaded on my app. So I couldn't even use it. I wound up carrying my iPad around with me for 3 days. And I think you're right. And by the way, it should be noted that the level of complaining about the app while people were at the meeting was striking.
Yeah, you would think that with the hundreds of meetings that happen all the time, there's a software that is well appreciated and well designed, that they don't have to go to one that is just infuriating.
We don't run the organization, and yes, I agree with you. Laurent, you were nodding on the app as well, but I don't want to make this about the app any more than we have to do.
I cannot agree more. The app was terrible, and I agree with Scott that it's hard to understand why you need to reinvent the wheel at every meeting. I mean, all the meeting have basically the same requirements, so you would expect to have a simple app that works, and it was terrible. So everyone was complaining about it.
Now, let's put the app to bed and talk about the rest of the meeting. What did you like about it?
Apart from the app, I think the meeting was interesting and very busy. Also, a lot of interaction. And this is, of course, what we value after being away for almost 2 years. We've been many times to Boston, and I like Boston, even though Scott claimed that is not as entertaining and busy as New York. Still, it's a nice city, even though I didn't have time to visit anything. But good meeting.
I think we're in complete alignment there. I don't think I ever left the Copley complex the entire time we were in town. I walked 4 blocks to dinner one night. That was about it. And nonetheless, still got in 15,000 steps a day, which is a comment on how good the conference was. Louise, please go ahead. I know you weren't there, but what did you, from afar?
I think it's interesting because obviously I was virtual. Your issues with the app were certainly issues we had virtually, and now 20% of the AASLD audience were virtual. There were very, very few sessions streamed live. Some of them were Zoom sessions, which were only open to Zoom in the US. So it was very frustrating when you got on to be not able to access some of these sessions. The Zoom sessions weren't recorded. And despite saying that the sessions would be up within 24 hours of being seen, it took 48 hours and more for Fridays to go up. And the complaints on the platform and the virtual of what was going on and was just as poor. And you just couldn't find the sessions. I echo what you all say about reinventing the wheel. When a system like Easel works so well that you can stream all rooms from 7 different locations, you can get replay, you can get it all in real time, works so well. This was the most disappointing virtual experience, and some people will have paid $1,200 for that virtual inexperience, realistically. Even on Twitter and all the social media, you couldn't keep up with what was going on because you weren't being able to see and experience what everybody else was experiencing. So I think we do need to reinvent the wheel for next year. I think it's in San Diego. It would be great to be able to have an experience that's a virtual experience that was as good as last year. This wasn't a virtual experience to write home for 20% of the audience.
So, Louise, I know you're well-traveled in North America. Have you been to San Diego?
I've never been to San Diego. I've been to California a couple of times, but not San Diego.
You have to come to the meeting next year. San Diego's fantastic, really.
I was planning on ASL, but I didn't make it this year.
I can second everything that's been said about the quality of the meeting and the quality of the app. 2 other things I think were noteworthy. First of all, the patient track was huge, and a whole range of episodes. And the amazing thing was they had a room set aside for it, and they had an overflow room. And for one of the patient track sessions that I chose to go to, but got too late because we were trying to fix my app before we gave up on it down at the tech desk, I was not able to get into the meeting room. And frankly, to get into the overflow room, I had to stand outside the door. So the level of interest in patient events was really high, and I think that's a good thing. And then the second thing, this is in some ways more American thing than a meeting thing, but a little bit of each, is that Diwali was, Saturday night? And AASLD did a Diwali celebration, which I thought was really fantastic. You know, we pride ourselves in the States as being a country of immigrants, and I remember when I was a teenager is when the Western ethnic groups were becoming more broadly accepted, Jews, Italians most notably. And there were moments in my teenage years when I went somewhere and they would do something, usually play Hava Nagila, and I would say, wow, this is different. We're really part of the show now, part of the country. And I was looking at the faces of some of the South Asian folks Saturday night, the young kids in their 20s and 30s. Of course, I was younger than that 50 years ago, but same basic idea. And the looks they had on their faces were really the same look I remember from when I started realizing the Jewish culture was being accepted in America. One of the things we do best is integrate people coming into the country, most people coming into the country, most groups coming into the country. And I thought that was a fantastic thing for AASLD to do.
Well, they should have had an overflow room for the party. It was so crowded, you were just standing up like matchsticks.
And then they did the dance floor where you could stand up like a matchstick on the dance floor, which felt like a hot box. So with all that, let's dive in. My other point about the meeting is that the phrase, if I had $1 for every time I heard the phrase, everything will change in March, I wouldn't have to pay for anything at the meeting. And I mentioned that noting that Madrigal is actually sponsoring this episode, but tremendous amount of excitement and anticipation about March 14th, which for anyone who does not recall is the Resmetirom PDUFA date at FDA. So with that, not just talking about Resmetirom, but talking about meds, why don't we dive in by talking about interesting things we saw about medications at the meeting, drugs in development or data on drugs that are currently in market.
Well, kind of overlooked in all the frenzy around getting close to likely approval in NASH. There was a drug trial that basically introduced what is sure to be a new approved drug for PBC, elafibranor. Data are really convincing. The drug is well tolerated. The New England Journal paper came out literally, I think, the day after the meeting. So it's already passed, intense peer review, and it offers a straightforward option to patients with PBC who don't respond to either obeticholic acid or urso. I thought that was pretty nice.
In no particular order, A, I agree with you, and B, in some ways, the more exciting thing is that there are 2 of them, right? Because seladelpar is also through phase 3 and reviewed and a late breaker. I've always said marketing experience that with the first drug, the question is whether, and with the second drug, the question is which. And the two of them coming on market at the same time will, I think, speed payer acceptance, frankly, and will allow us to have a much richer discussion about what PBC patients need and the best way to treat them. And that's a tough disease, and I think it's a fantastic thing for those patients. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, the other drug that I was excited about, in part because of my own scientific interest, was the integrin antagonist by Pliant that at least shows a hint of efficacy and certainly safety in patients with PSC. So that's, PBC, we now have likely 4 or 5 drugs, and we know that PBC patients are coming to transplant much less than they used to. But PSC, no progress at all, at least in terms of approved drugs ever. So a hint of efficacy is better than we've ever seen at PSC.
Noted. Laurent, anything about meds in the meeting that you found particularly compelling or exciting?
No, I would tend to agree with Scott. I was more impressed by the rare disease field, PBC and PSC, than any other field, including viral hepatitis or MASLD and MASH.
I thought it was helpful to spend a little bit more time thinking about the 2 FGF21 papers in cirrhosis, the pegozafermin and the efruxifermin paper, because obviously that's another area that needs a lot of help. And it's starting to look like the class might help. I mean, the efrux trial, we're going to have to look at the 52 or 54-week data. I forget which it is. But between that and the pegoza trial, it does feel like that class of drugs might bring benefit to the case, and folks and Alpine 4 as well. I entered the meeting hopeful that I would leave the meeting hopeful about cirrhosis. And in fact, I did. I think the advanced MASH, basic MASH, I agree with you, Laurent, not nearly as exciting as the rare drug stuff, but I thought the cirrhosis was intriguing and potentially helpful.
Yeah, I have a slightly different bias, Roger, and so far, and based in part on some work we published that I've discussed in a previous podcast. I still think that cirrhosis, while it's certainly a continuum from non-cirrhotic MASH, has a unique or increasingly unique repertoire of drivers of disease and targets. For a patient with NASH with intermediates, F2 or even F3, if you stop them in their tracks in terms of disease progression, you've achieved, at least a significant success by preventing cirrhosis, and the FDA recognizes that. When you're talking about cirrhosis, holding steady on the level of fibrosis is not good enough. We really need to have mechanisms that regress fibrosis, and that's a very tall order in that stage of disease, and we don't really have drugs that are specifically aimed at that. You have all the metabolic drugs like the FGF21s, and now, of course, Resmetirom and others that are looking to extend their potential utility of the drug by showing benefit in cirrhotics, but they're not really designed mechanistically to attack the scar and do the things that a cirrhotic liver has to do to get better. So I'm cautiously pessimistic, shall we say, that there's going to be major breakthroughs with the existing drugs in cirrhosis, because none of them have a direct action that should be resorbing scar, even though we attenuate the injury.
So I guess part of what I bring to a discussion like this is the perspective of having had a bout of metastatic melanoma 11 years ago, and understanding at that point in time that if you've got a disease for which there isn't a lot to treat it, the trick is stay healthy until the drugs catch up. So if in fact those drugs can merely attenuate, but they buy us time, or they buy patients time for us to get to better agents, to me that's a huge step in the right direction.
I couldn't agree more, Roger. Given that we have a desert of approved drugs right now, resmetirom notwithstanding, any improvement is welcome and urgently needed. I keep coming back to the example of Hep C, which was an unknown virus in 1988. In 1989, it was discovered, and it's a single virus. It took 25 years to come up with curative therapies, which are miraculous, of course. But that was a simple disease. It was a single virus, albeit many quasi-species. The livers responded more or less the same with variable vigor of fibrosis. And still it took 25 years. And the progress was completely incremental. It started with monotherapy with interferon, then ribavirin, then pegylated interferon, then direct-acting antivirals, and then, the pure direct-acting antivirals without interferon and ribavirin, and that took a long time. So I think we need to hopefully continue to see progress to keep patients hopeful and their providers, and frankly, to keep funders and investors interested as well, because, as you know, I interface a lot with commercial entities, and they have a terribly short attention span. If they don't see return on investment, in an unreasonable amount of time, they pull out and look for some other disease of the day. So unfortunately, we have to also attend to the needs of those stakeholders, because in the end, their investments drive smaller companies in particular to make progress.
I couldn't agree more. And I think one of the exciting things was noting how many of the smaller companies have been successful at raising money, right? I mean, I think Madrigal just raised $500 million or something like that. CymaBay raised $224 million for seladelpar and PBC. Akero just had to raise. A whole bunch of people have this year been able to raise money, whereas for the previous 2 or 3 years, nobody wanted to.
Yeah. And that's in what is still a very challenging climate for biotech investment, but these opportunities seem fruitful enough that investors are willing to commit. So that's a really good sign.
Yes. Now, coming back to cirrhosis, again, I agree with Scott. It's not an easy task. Of course, we can learn from Hep C, but this is a very different setting. I mean, we don't have, of course, a good surrogate as HCV or NA, for instance, like in Hep C. Also, there are a lot of comorbidity that complicate. I mean, these patients are much more difficult to handle than the patients with HCV. Even some of them happen to be overweight or drink a little bit. It was much more easy than in MASLD. And I mean, there's a lot of issue when you want to develop a drug in this setting. Might be also DDI, because most of these patients are taking a lot of drug. Adherence, of course, safety. And for the moment being, we've seen that the few drugs that are currently under study are pretty well tolerated. But don't forget, these are very small samples, so you need to be cautious, and we need more data. And the data that have been presented, actually, they were limited by the fact that we're either small cohort or short follow-up, or interim analysis. So it's difficult to figure out what is going to happen.
Laurent, you bring up a really interesting point, and I'd like to frame it not differently, but a little more broadly, which is we were spoiled by hepatitis C. When we finally got to direct-acting antivirals, it was test and treat, give them, with few exceptions, a standard regimen, and they're done. And that was it. NASH, I think we need to think of more like we think of other chronic inflammatory diseases. And the analogy I always think about is inflammatory bowel disease, because you have patients who show up with, symptoms in this case. They have histologic evidence of colonic inflammation. They're tried on the first drug. Some respond, many do not. And then they go to a second drug, then they go to a third drug, all the time with no clues as to why they responded or didn't respond. And we're in a similar situation. And, I think the proof of the pudding is, even though Madrigal's drug is likely and hopefully will be approved, it only benefited 25% of the patients. So we have a long way to go. So, an approved drug is fantastic, but that's really just the beginning.
So, Scott, that's not a bad bridge into NITs, which may be where we go. But in fact, let's do that. Okay, because one of my favorite presentations of the conference was, I think Stephen Harrison did this one. It was off the NASH trial. And it was using AI, using histoindex, SGH, second generation harmonic convergence. And what it showed, first of all, is that the efficacy rate in placebo was about a third when you looked at it with some of the measures that they were creating.
A third of what's reported by conventional?
No, a third of patients.
I see.
But by that same measure, the efficacy in I don't remember exactly how they did this one because it was late in the day. The efficacy in the test group was 54%. So it was still only a 20% spread, if you will, a slightly bigger spread. But first of all, if you learn to look at white space, which is what I was taught in statistics, it means that of the 66% of patients who were not spontaneously improving, about 40% more of those improved because they're on resmetirom, as compared to the data simply using semi-qualitative CRM measures, where only about 1/7 of the patients who weren't improved, number one. Number two, I talked to Dean Tai afterwards, and he said virtually every study they do when they use this kind of an analytic shows about a third of the population improve spontaneously. Now, that's one of the real complications here, right? You don't get a lot of spontaneous improvement in Hep C. So if you can clear the virus, over time the scar will clear, and that if you don't clear the virus, things aren't going to get better, whereas this drug's a lot more fluky. But I was intrigued by the idea that there were methodologies you could use that would AI in this case, that would A, get consistent placebo reads across trials, and B, would be able to be somewhat more sensitive in demonstrating who is improving. Because the criteria we're using to approve resmetirom is just how many people regress one level in 12 months or 18 months, right? And we've learned over time that hepatitis can take, 5 years to regress?
That's right. And bariatric surgery is similar.
Yes. So I think it's just a tough standard, is all I'm saying. It might be better. We might look in 5 years and find the drugs did better than we thought. Just a thought. Laurent, when I think of NITs, I think of you. So
What do I?
Let's go there.
Maybe I can briefly touch upon biotic surgery, because there was a very interesting presentation by Guillaume Lassailly, a French guy from the group of Philippe Mathurin, on the long term. So this was a very large study spanning over more than 20 years of a huge cohort of biotic surgery candidates. And most of them underwent liver biopsy and a subset paired liver biopsy. And they tried to correlate the improvement in histology, MASH resolution, and with the long-term outcome. To make a long story short, they've shown a graph, of course, and it was pretty nice to see that if you had MASH resolution and regression of fibrosis, of course, you had a better outcome, and quite similar to those who didn't have a MASH. So these are quite unique data. Actually, it's the same cohort that Philippe has published now twice, in 2015 in Gastro after 1 year, and the 5 years follow-up in 2020. But so this is the follow-up of the same cohort. But still, I think interesting data that would be published in a good journal.
I agree. I've had enormous respect for Philippe and Guillaume. These data are the best around for sure, and they tell us something we'd hoped was true, is if you eliminate disease, you improve the outcomes. That's, after all, what the regulatory agencies are looking for. The challenge, of course, is which surrogates, and that's your expertise, will give us a high degree of confidence that their improvement signals a likelihood in improved outcomes down the road. And that's really where the rubber meets the road now in terms of getting away from liver biopsy, is can we have confidence that an improvement in a cluster or a single biomarker really will give us confidence the drug is working?
No, I don't think you can rely on a single marker. I mean, you need a kind of a cluster of several, at least 2 or 3 unrelated markers going in the same direction for this to be a strong signal. Otherwise, you cannot trust or rely on a single marker, especially with some markers that are confounders. For instance, of course, liver stiffness is something that everyone has in mind, but in this population, we have high BMI. BMI is a major confounder. So when I mean unrelated marker, if you take health, for instance, BMI or obesity is not a confounder for health as it is for liver stiffness. So if both are going in the same direction, I think it's pretty reassuring that you're seeing something meaningful.
Laurent, do you have any experience with the HepQuant? I've always been struck by how we are so dependent on histology and indirect measures when functional tests are so valuable to pulmonary fibrosis and biopsies are meaningless, and yet here we have no good functional tests.
Right. No, I don't have any personal experience. I've seen this data that have been around for a while now, but no personal experience.
Conceptually, does it appeal to you?
Yes. Yes, it does. But not many independent validation, or let's say external validation. So far, it's been around for a while and not really... No major breakthrough, actually.
Yeah, well, that has as much or more to do with the small scale that they've been operating on for too long. I'm hopeful they'll turn the corner, but it has been very frustrating. They had what looked like, and still may well be, a very promising technology of a breath test to measure liver reserve or liver function, and they've just rolled it out so slowly that it's kind of, people have lost interest to an extent, which is unfortunate.
So, Scott, I hadn't paid a ton of attention to HepQuant over the last couple of years. The original test I remember talking about years ago, it was really tough test to administer.
Yeah, they've completely streamlined it now.
Okay, so maybe to some degree they're still dealing with their own bad press.
Yeah, well, it's when good things happen or bad things happen, it takes a while for the news to get around, and bad news travels faster than good news. So, I spoke to the founder. I don't work with the company at all, but I spoke with the founder, Greg Everson, and they're moving along through the FDA. They have both a blood test and possibly even a non-invasive detection system to streamline the test and make it more accessible, so you don't have to breathe into a bag and mail the bag to Colorado. So I'd keep an eye on it, only because it's the only one that is still viable as a functional test, apart from just, looking at the INR and the PT, which we know is not good enough. So we'll see.
Yeah. So, Laurent, Were there any of the NIT studies or presentations or any of the sessions? There were a bunch of sessions about NITs and a bunch of presentations about. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Was there anything you found particularly of interest or helpful or not?
Right. The one I really found interesting, actually, I have to say two things. First, it was not presented surprisingly as oral, but as a poster. The second issue is I have quite a bias and a conflict of interest because I'm part of this study. But the reason I'm part of this study, it's a very large cohort of 16,000 people worldwide, huge cohort. Of course, it's retrospective. And basically what they look at is NIT and liver-related outcome. So there are already a lot of study in the literature, but most of them being single center or with a small population. The follow-up is not very long. It's about 2 years. And the number of liver-related events, as usual in MASH as compared to HCV, is lower. But still, it's interesting. So they tested, of course, liver stiffness, but also these scores called Agile 3 plus and Agile 4. And they go, of course, in parallel with liver stiffness. But what they show is they could stratify nicely their population according to the value. And this was really well correlated with the likelihood of developing liver-related event. Basically, you had a low-risk group, intermediate risk, and high-risk group. So these are, of course, to me, very interesting data. And of course, even more interesting would be to know whether the reverse is true. In other words, if you use these NITs as surrogate, and I mean, now I think the level of evidence is pretty good for the relationship between liver outcome in general, not only events, but mortality and let's say the so-called MALO, for instance, major advanced liver outcome, and this NIT, especially liver stiffness. But the whole question is whether the reverse is true. In other words, if liver stiffness decreases over time, does it mean that number of liver-related events will decrease? And this we don't really know, actually. And this is what, of course, we would like to see. So I hope from this large database and series we can get this information. But this was not clear. So maybe in the forthcoming meeting we should get this data, which of course are very important because this is the first step. And also like a proof of concept that this works, because we don't really know for the moment being.
Laurent, I want to go back for a sec to Scott's previous question and your answer, which is, the whole goal, one of the goals of NITs, ideally, is to get the FDA and EMA away from biopsy. But if we're going to need a cluster of NITs, and if that cluster might vary from drug to drug candidate, depending on the mode of action, that's a lot to ask a regulatory agency to swallow. And I fear it might make it harder for us to get to that place. There was a session on Friday afternoon, late session on NITs, where Michelle Long for Novo Nordisk actually asked that question. If I'm doing drug development, I'm trying to figure out how to get it approved as an NIT. What am I supposed to do? And I think the group agreed that there was no one NIT that would solve that problem. But I would think if you're a drug developer, particularly at a point in time where agency is still relying on biopsy, that makes it a little hard to figure out what paths to take.
Well, the FDA hasn't shown a lot of flexibility to move outside of biopsy, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, I agree. I would think this is one of the reasons why, though. I mean, if you think rule in medicine is do no harm, rule 1 in federal agencies is basically never get your face in the newspaper for something that went wrong. So the easiest way to do that is don't do very much, right? Or don't do very much that's truly different. What you do that's different has to be simple so that it's defensible. I fear that to get to NITs, we're going to need some kind of a solution where we can say, either for every drug that's being evaluated, use these 2 or 3 things, or for drugs that claim to be primarily antifibrotic, do this, for drugs to be primarily defatting, do that. But I emerged from Boston with a sense it might be more challenging than I felt it was when I got there.
Laurent's the expert, not me. I'm just frustrated maybe because the technologies have not advanced as quickly as the therapies, maybe because, this is really the biggest unmet need in accelerating trials, in my opinion. It's not lack of targets. It's a skittishness on the part of companies to invest in long trials that require liver biopsy, which, by the way, is still being graded in the most primitive way imaginable by 0 to 4 as opposed to digital pathology, which I think is unacceptable.
See, I don't get why they don't do that one immediately.
Well, the FDA, at least when I've heard them speak about it, say they're very open to it. Just it's your job, academics and clinical research investigators, it's your job to show us the data. And there is data now that features of fibrosis on the digital biopsy are more sensitive in detecting improvement and more robust in predicting outcomes. So I'm not sure what else they need.
I'm certainly not the one to ask. Laurent, do you have any familiarity with the answer to that question? What you think the regulators will need to actually move along the path on this?
No, I don't.
So, Scott, now let me turn to you, basic science. What did we learn? What did we see in science at that meeting that was helpful or innovative or different?
Well, I concentrate mostly on the inflammation fibrosis, and I would say that the progress was heartening but incremental. There were no big breakthroughs, but a lot more use of single-cell technologies that are giving us much more refined and granular understanding of pathogenesis, in particular the heterogeneity of fibrogenic cells in liver. There's still a big lacune in our understanding of fibrosis degradation, although I know we and other groups now are tackling this for the first time in 20 or 25 years. So I would say nothing that, for a more general audience they should celebrate, except to say that there is quite a bit of progress because the technologies are advancing our ability to peer into the pathogenic mechanisms with much greater clarity.
Some of the most interesting stuff I saw on this subject were just private presentations, not even things that were in the meeting, with people showing me work they were doing. I guess taking a look at the impact on brain of diabetes, really, and obesity, but MASH relatedly. I don't recall seeing a lot of basic science that I don't understand everything I see.
I went to a couple of the basic sessions, including the fibrosis session. There's actually a couple of presentations on the senescence of stellate cells as being a target, how they create so senescence is a state of cells where they're more advanced and they are effectively aging and coming close to their lifespan. And in doing so, they become very inflammatory, fibrogenic. And so there's a push to try to get rid of senescent cells. There were a couple of very interesting papers, one which reinforces data that was published some time ago, that the more senescent stellate cells you have, the more permissive your microenvironment for cancer development. So that was, I would say, reassuring. There was another that tried to treat senescence using targeted what are called senolytics to kill senescent cells, and that also looked promising. But those drugs have been around for a long time and somehow haven't advanced yet. So I didn't see anything that was super ripe for drug development or translation, but certainly lots of studies across the meeting about the role of genetics, the role of diet, the role of different polymorphisms, really genetic. So, it's all adding up. It just hasn't kind of crystallized into a single coherent picture of where the disease starts, what makes it better, what makes it worse, and what are the kind of Achilles heels of the disease from a therapeutic perspective. Because it seems that a lot of the trials are moving the needle on different aspects of NASH, but in the end, they don't really improve the disease. They may improve the fat, they may improve the inflammation, but we don't know if that's really getting to the heart of why this disease occurs at all and why it's shown up in the last 25 or 30 years.
Well, so you're the person who taught me that how it progresses and how it regresses may be two different things.
Yes, I think that's, as true as it's ever been. And there may even be genetic determinants, as there are for who progresses. There may be different genetic determinants for who's prone to regression when the disease activity goes down.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So, Louise, with that, let's go over to some of the things that you were looking at in the meeting, even if it took you a day or two to look at them.
In context of this session, there were a couple of interesting posters, particularly on FibroScan, and one that I found particularly interesting was the vibration-controlled transient elastography-based parameter predicts clinical outcomes in liver transplant recipients. Because, of course, it's approved now for post-transplant patients. But what they did was they also used the CAT in this poster, and it was done by Alok Baral and the team from the Virginia Commonwealth University Health System at Richmond, VA. So they basically looked at the liver stiffness and surrogate markers of hepatic fibrosis, and with FibroScan, obviously. And what they did was they ruled in everybody had had a liver transplant successful between 2015 and 22. They excluded end-stage liver disease and damage, acute rejection. And what they looked at was FibroScans over 15.5 as clinical fibrosis, or significant fibrosis, to be fair, and a CAT they used of 270. The data wasn't overly surprising in that liver stiffness predicted the outcome and mortality post-liver transplant. But what they did do is then then subdivide that by looking at the controlled attenuation parameter, and that predict the risk of future myocardial infarction in some of these liver transplant patients. But what was particularly interesting was what they didn't comment on was the mortality curves in those patients with and without, or above and below 270. They died earlier than the patients who then went on to get MIs with CAP. So it's quite an interesting diagram. The death rate starts at around about 20 months following transplantation if the CAP was just taken on its own at a level of 270. And whereas in the other categories, mortality didn't start to show until sort of 36 to 40 months. So it's the first time I've seen CAP used as its own parameter to sort of look at predicting mortality. And we've had CAP available now for a number of years. It'd be nice to see that second part utilised a lot more in the evidence that we're seeing, not just stiffness. There was another poster doing methotrexate, and because we now have surrogate markers like VTCE, and that we can monitor serially these patients. So over a number of years, they've gone on to sort of support the evidence that methotrexate doesn't cause more fibrosis, and there's been a couple of evidence-based papers out recently that have done that. So it was now looking at, we've got enough data on long cohorts, even of small numbers, to look at with some of these surrogate markers now. Those were sort of interesting because they're applicable to practice now. The one thing that I was really keen to see part of was we talk about getting the implementation of the medications out, but there was a very good session on evolving impact of hepatology associates, obviously close to my heart being an advanced practitioner, in the context that we're looking at a 34% rise in hepatology need in the US. Obviously it's AASLD by 2023. So we're now into that 10-year period, but we're going to look at a 35% reduction in the amount of hepatologists available. And although allied health professionals will increase during that time, we're still looking at a deficit of 30% in allied health just in hepatology. And it's more or less split 80% gastro, 20% hepatology. But we are not going, unless we start to look at way we get strategies out to deliver these new medications like Resmetirom and anything coming in the future, we're going to be really, really struggling to deliver expert care in locations that count to patients. And the more rural you are in any country, the less your survival rates are, the less access you get to care. So it's about being able to use the diagnostics that the guys have commented on so nicely out in better environments. And how do we do that? How do we implement it when we know that we've got a shortfall, but allied health is going to be our area of strength. But it's not an area that I see targeted for education at the moment. We've got patient advocacy, we've got clinician advocacy. We just need a bit more allied health advocacy. So there's some really, really nice sessions. And you commented on the beginning of the patient strength at this conference was very, very key. Unfortunately, you can't see a lot of those sessions. They were Zoom or in real time. But one of the comments that struck me was at the patient advocate in the very first session of Stronger Together. And they were talking about lived experience and the fact that lived experience of patients is basically data with a soul. And I thought that was such a great term. It is their experience and how they do it. Data with a soul. So that's a new category.
That's interesting.
Sort of tail into the NITs. And I didn't attend any of the basic science.
Shocking. You lied. If you were actually in the room for the patient sessions, patient track sessions, tremendous energy. I mean, those folks really felt like they were at the table or a significant presence in the event as compared to merely window dressing. And that's usually important. Look, we're not going to be able to do this without advocates, right? In that regard, I'm going to tiptoe slowly for a minute or two into nomenclature.
Yes, but I think the patients, because it opened the conference, were that much more empowered. The patient sessions were the leading part of the conference. So I felt the enthusiasm in the room being virtual, and I think it was, some of the sessions came off really well. And I think Sue Wang, who took that first Stronger Together session, 150 patients and patient advocates and caregivers were in that room. 7,000 people were attending the meeting. 20% was virtual. Over 2,000 2,000 abstracts. The patients were front and center, as you quite rightly said. And the sort of message that sends is powerful.
So the other interesting thing to me in that context, as I say, was not just the patients, but patients as it related to nomenclature. I thought there was a very effective session co-chaired by Maru Ranella and Mina Bonsal on Saturday morning, where they took 2 hours and they basically took a status of where are we at right now in nomenclature. And if you think about it, when we headed into this transition, there were 3 major questions for which there were not yet answers. One was regulatory, which was if we change the names, are we changing the definitions in such a way that we will slow up approvals of drugs or devices or diagnostics? The second was educational informational, which is, okay, we're changing the name, but are we changing how an actual patient is classified? Because that makes treatment really a mess. And then the third, obviously, is how do you communicate the name change? Now, against that, there are other countervailing benefits. I think MASLD is a benefit. Getting alcohol, non-alcoholic met onto a continuum where you're considering them all. Steatotic liver disease is, I think, helpful. But in the 8:30 session on Saturday morning, I think they pretty effectively put to bed the first 2 of those issues. First, you had George McCarr from the FDA flat out say, we are now using the terms interchangeably. We're not going to tell anybody what terms to use. We're going to treat them as interchangeable because we see no difference. That was one. The second was both Rune Sanyal, working out of the NIMBLE database, and Quentin Anstey, working out of Litmus database, talking about overmapping patients from one set of definitions to the other and getting 95 to 98% convergence in both cases. So that's pretty good. If you overmap anything on anything, probably even identical twins, you're only going to get 98% convergence because that's how the world works. So that was, I think, important. And then even more than that, Greg Gores then got up and said, as editor-in-chief in Hepatology, we're not accepting any more papers on this subject. We think this is done. We think overmap has been proven. I mean, there were people who, when we asked them over the summer, they would tell us on this podcast, we're going to see a lot of research over the next 2 years on how are MASLD and NAFLD different, or MASH and NASH. And Gores said, we're not publishing that anymore. We think it's done. So if those 2 issues are out of play, then scientifically we're done, right? And the statement about communication at the podcast that struck me most forcefully came from Tony Vigliali, who's a patient advocate who's been on this podcast a couple of times. And it was really simple. He said, look, you have something in your chest. Medically, it's called a myocardial infarction. Your doctor tells you you had a heart attack. That's what's going to happen here. He said, the doctor's still going to say you got fat on your liver, whatever you call the disease. So in terms of communicating to patients on a practical one-on-one level, that shouldn't change a lot. I don't know how you guys feel about that. Those of you who treat patients or support the treatment of patients, but from the side of being a patient, that was pretty compelling to me. I don't know how anyone else feels.
Well, I think there's some truth to that. I mean, patients don't know what steatosis is. No, one way or the other, you have to use the word fat. Part of the effort to change the name was to avoid the notion of this is a fatty liver disease. But at some level, you do have to acknowledge it. Otherwise, you can't explain what you're talking about to the patient. I think the process was very impressive and rigorous. I give a lot of credit to ASLD and EASL, Jeff Lazarus, who spearheaded this, who's really a master at these kinds of groupthink decisions. And personally, I find it a little much more of a mouthful when I'm lecturing to spit it out, but I guess that'll get better over time. And there was an acknowledgement that although the evidence for this was scant, there was a concern or an acknowledgement that using the word non-alcoholic in a patient with what is now MASLD would make them feel like we were being pejorative in some way because the word alcoholic was in there and they don't want to hear that if they had nothing to do with alcohol. I never saw any data that really supported that, but there was some logic to it. And if it helps patients come to terms with their disease without feeling somehow pigeonholed or accused, then that's probably a good thing.
Although the representative from India at EASL last year in Washington made the point that in India, non-alcoholic is a good thing because you say cirrhosis, people immediately think you've been drinking, and that's against the religion. So I thought Zobair and Jeff, and Jeff and a few other people published a paper that showed that the stigma around obesity and diabetes in the eye of the patient is far greater than the stigma around fatty liver. That where the stigma around fatty liver was greatest, in fact, is in the eye of the provider.
Right. I can maybe add a comment because I was part of this study. And this is a global study. And the interesting part is stigmatization was mainly observed in the US, not in the rest of the world, and mostly related to obesity rather than steatosis, because steatosis does not show, whereas obesity, of course, is obvious. But that's an interesting study that will be published soon in GAP. And I agree with Scott, we don't have much data. I was in Chicago at the meeting for the nomenclature meeting, and I remember some patients were claiming this, but we had no real evidence or data. So now we have. And just maybe a last comment from the French perspective, because I agree with Scott that if you tell a patient he has steatosis, he has no clue most of the time. If you say, and especially in France, if you have foie gras, of course, it rings a bell. And it's rather positive than negative. They don't know, they don't feel stigmatized if you tell them they have foie gras, because everyone knows foie gras in France. And this is a very positive word, especially before Christmas.
I love that.
That's good. I've heard for years people describing a fatty liver as being a bit like pate, but I've never taken it in reverse and said, in France, if you call it foie gras, that's a good thing. I like that.
Well, I'm struck by Laurent's comment about the stigmatization being more an American thing. And frankly, I'm not surprised given the hostile nature of our politics and some of our leadership and the name calling that characterized national politics for the last few years. There's an article in today's Times about how our former president's vitriol and rudeness has become, has established a very unfortunate standard in our country, that people are intolerant and abusive in their language. And I'm going off on a major tangent here, but I'm sad to think they're probably related.
Scott, I am as appalled by the coarseness as you are, and we're not going to talk about what I saw fathers of young girls wearing on their T-shirts as I was out with my granddaughter on Saturday, but it was coarse and appalling beyond belief. But that said, part of the issue is cultural, which is that a society needs to achieve a certain level of affluence before obesity becomes a problem. If you go back 100 years in the U.S., when people were still on the farm or just coming off the farm, obesity was shown as a sign of prosperity, that you could afford to buy enough food to get fat.
Interestingly, I remember the early days of HIV, and obesity, or at least lack of thinness, was interpreted as a sign that you aren't HIV infected. It's ironic.
It is ironic. But if you go back, we think of Theodore Roosevelt as being a remarkably fit president because he's energetic and he did things, but look at pictures of him. And in today's society, he would be deemed morbidly obese. And his successor, Taft, could just about get out of a bathtub. That was 110 years ago. Now we've progressed. But I was having this conversation with Zobair actually on one of the interviews that we did last week, and his comment was roughly the same, which is that there are parts of the world where obesity is seen as a sign of prosperity as compared to being seen as a sign of poor health. That's before we get to foie gras.
Yeah, that reminds me of an important theme that emerged. I hesitate to use the term the 800-pound gorilla in the context of what we're talking about. But the weight loss drugs are game changers in terms of how we manage obesity, and their impact on steatotic liver disease, and particularly NASH, as well as MASH cirrhosis, are yet to be established. My own prediction, which is more educated guesswork, is that some patients who lose weight on these drugs will have an important and meaningful liver improvement, and some will not. We'll see. But it was all over the meeting indirectly because it's, clearly influencing prescribing habits in as vigorous a way as anything I can think of. Well,
and Arun Sanyal's presentation on retatrutide, right, is what's to come. We're now looking at 3 triple agents in development: the Altimmune drug, pemvidutide, the drug that Merck licensed from Hanmi in Korea, efinopegdutide, if I remember correctly, and then the Lilly drug, retatrutide. And they're all triple agents, and they're all showing staggering reductions in liver fat.
Yeah, they're basically medical equivalents of bariatric surgery in terms of the amount of weight loss.
Yeah. So my question to the two of you is, do we believe that they will have the same impact that bariatric surgery showed in the study that Laurent referenced at the beginning of this episode, or is there reason to think it might be different?
I think we don't know, Roger, because I think it would be naive to assume that weight loss by any means is the same, meaning that, there's a lot of data that would suggest the beneficial impact of bariatric surgery in part is mediated by changes to the microbiome. I don't know if that happens with pharmacologically induced weight loss. So I think we don't really know. But I would not assume that losing 30 pounds by bariatric surgery or by medical therapy is going to be absolutely the same. But we don't know. We'll find out.
I agree. We don't really know. And don't forget that the candidates for bariatric surgery are just a minority. They are not representative of the majority of patients we're seeing. So I think it's difficult to extrapolate. And also with these drugs, of course, we don't have mid or long-term data on maintenance, because if you stop the drug, then you gain weight again. So I think it's impossible for the moment being to extrapolate. Of course, it's tempting, but you have to be very cautious.
My thoughts on what you were discussing there is actually coming back to allied health. There were a couple of very good presentations. One that Mazen Nuruddin mentioned in the last sum up of the session, which was the WILD study. By adding advanced practitioners, you got 77% better weight loss into the management. But also in the sessions on the advanced practitioners and what they bring to healthcare, they focused on a MASLD clinic that was run by Allied Health and the good outcomes and how that's done. And they were using semaglutide and liraglutide as examples of the amount of input they put into these patients. So if we are going to go down these routes, then we really do need to be able to facilitate the appropriate support mechanisms in for people that we put on these medications, be to give them the best support that they can get and the outcomes of those medications. So the more medications we add, the more complicated the ability to manage each of these individual patients becomes. And actually the loss of potential revenue or health cost for each one we lose if we don't put in the right structures becomes bigger. Then people say, oh, a drug failed or they've lost to follow-up. Actually, we need to be looking at the structures and the pathways that we put in around there. And there's some very good evidence from this session that I'd ask people to go and look. If you're going to be implementing these, look to people who've already done it and have got some really good ideas and evidence to back that up.
Agreed. And I'm going to add one thought and I'm going to final question, which is, and has to do with both Laurent's comment and Louise's. The gastric side effects with these agents are likely to be significant, appear to be pretty significant in what we're hearing so far. It may well be that the triple agent becomes a way for people to lose weight, but then over time they're maintained on a GLP-1.
It's possible.
That we might see an induction maintenance kind of a strategy here for reasons having to do with cost and also having to do with long-term tolerability. Well, we'll have to see, but I think it's one of the places where that's a possibility. Okay, so wrap-up question. One thing that will be different next year in San Diego.
I mean, besides the app and the weather?
I'm not sure that'll be different. I like your confidence. I'm sure about the weather. I'm not sure about the
weather.
Yeah, the weather.
Well, we managed to avoid speaking about it, but I think it's safe to assume that there'll be an approved drug, and how that changes the dynamic, I think I can't entirely predict, but it will change it.
Okay, and that's why I mentioned at the beginning that everyone was talking about March 14th. Okay, Laurent.
That would be my guess as well. It's going to change the field.
Well, apart from the drug, I'm hoping to be there. That'll be different. I wasn't at ASL this year. I want to be in ASL personally next year. That'll be different because I'm staying away from the technology.
San Diego's worth it. So the other difference I think that's noteworthy is Madrigal produced a lot of papers were produced out of the Maestro's phase 3 trial data from the various studies, and we're starting to see data from NAIL and IT and some of the consortia that weren't Litmus and Nimble. I expect we'll see more of that next year, and that we'll see more pooling of data from multiple drug trials, particularly around issues of safety and NITs. And I'm hoping that can shed some light that we've been unable to shed in the smaller databases that we've seen so far. And then obviously we all agree, should Madrigal have successful conclusion of resmetirom at the FDA, which we're all kind of assuming at this point, that'll change everything a lot.
Well, I think for sure there'll be a lot of questions around what you need to get a drug approved. Certainly the drugs in development are going to keep moving forward. But I think just in terms of the optimism and certainly the clinical care pathway is going to be profoundly altered if you can hand the treatment to the patient. And then I would encourage us all to ask, how do we know which 25% are responding to the drug and should stay on it and which ones need something else? That's to be continued.
Great question. To be continued. So Scott, Laurent, Louise, thank you so much for joining. I think it's been a great conversation, and I will wave and say goodbye to all of you guys. Let's all say goodbye to our audience.
All right.
Today's episode of Surfing the MASH Tsunami, reviewing the highlights of TLM 2023, has been sponsored by Madrigal Pharmaceuticals.
Madrigal Pharmaceuticals is a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company pursuing novel therapeutics for non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, NASH, a liver disease with high unmet medical need. Madrigal's lead candidate, Resmetirom, is a liver-directed THR-beta agonist oral therapy that is designed to target key underlying causes of NASH. For more information, visit www.madrigalpharma.com. And now for the Season 4, Episode 49 Business Report.
Slava Ukraini, Chorem Slava, glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes, and also Am Yisrael Chai, people of Israel live. At the end of Stephen Sondheim's brilliant musical Sweeney Todd, the lead female character, Mrs. Lovett, in a moment of misery and exasperation, throws up her hands and says, "All the demons in hell have been sent to torment me tonight." As I look at rising virulent anti-Semitism in the U.S. and much of the West, unlike anything we've seen since Hitler, too many people's inability to hold in the same mental frame the horror of the Hamas's slaughter of the Israelites, the equally repugnant horror of Hamas treating Palestinians like propaganda pawns or cover for their military, and the loss of too many innocent Palestinian lives, coupled with the willingness of the U.S. House majority to abandon Ukraine. I ask myself, what has happened to the country and the world I grew up in and love so much? Once we get past this moment, perhaps we can explore ways to be more soulful, more caring, and looking at people who are not like us. For now, let's just hope the Ukrainian military maintains and perseveres through the coming winter, and then we can find a solution in the Mideast that preserves an Israel that does not have to fear its neighbors, and a Palestinian people, Palestinian state even, who, living next to but not at war with Israel, can pursue a better quality of life for themselves and their families. Slava Ukraini, Am Yisrael Chai.
TLM 2023 was a fantastic event. Congrats to AASLD.
TLM 23 is come and gone with much to remember, and, as we discuss on today's episode, an apt to forget. Great dialogues, great presentations, great times with great friends. Just a great event all around, and congrats to AASLD. This episode ends our formal AASLD coverage. We'll probably refer to it a couple of times in coming events, and Louise and I may do a one-on-one discussion about the patient and allied professional material in the meeting. But in terms of podcasts, this is it.
We'll be without yarn for a bit.
Our dear friend and co-host Jörn Schottenberg has taken a few weeks away from Tsunami to manage an exceptional travel schedule while getting some things in order back in Mainz. Until then, Louise and I will welcome one or two of our regular KOL friends to join each episode, and we're just going to keep rolling.
The nomenclature change at Tsunami is officially in transition.
2 weeks ago, as I reported in episode 47, we became officially known as Surfing the MASH Tsunami. We'll post our new graphics next week and open our surfingmash.com website probably the week after. That said, we believe in the principle of interchangeability, like the FDA. So emails or comments sent to the surfingnash.com site will forward automatically to the new site once it's open.
This week's Vault has another conversation from the TLM 2022 wrap-up episodes.
This week's Vault conversation looks back at Laurent Castera's contribution to the TLM 2022 wrap-up. As you know, today he was part of TLM 2023. This conversation, Season 3, Episode 55.3, focuses on some NIT screening presentations from TLM 2022, with particular focus on diabetic patients. Laurent always brings exceptional insights with him. This conversation is no exception. So that's it for this week. I want to thank our team, Jorn, Louise, Jake, Mike, Eric, Steve, for their work on this week's episode and for rolling with a shifting TLM episode schedule. Next week, we'll be back with a topic to be determined and a guest co-host as of yet unnamed. It'll be fantastic anyway. Until then, stay safe, surf on. If you're in the U.S., enjoy Thanksgiving and remember all we have to be thankful for. We'll see you next week on the podcast. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com and we will answer on the podcast or the website.